Greetings, everyone. Welcome to The Body Keeps the Score, Brain, Mind, and Body, and the Healing of Trauma by Vessel Van de Kolk, MD. This is part 9 of our study and discussion. Wow, the body definitely keeps the score, and racist man and racist woman are very, very much aware of trauma and how trauma just disrupts um, so much of a person's life, mind, brain, and body. Really, really tragic to be in a system on a planet dominated by racism, white supremacy, because trauma and racism, white supremacy go hand in hand. They must produce trauma in order for their victims to remain in a state, a helpless state, where they are confused and unaware of the trauma given to them by white supremacy, and unaware of and confused about what to do with it. Does anyone have any thoughts they'd like to share before I continue?
Yeah, I have something I wanted to share. I wanted to talk a bit about the veterans and how they're prime examples of how trauma was guiding them to do self-destructive things. For example, the guy who attempted to commit suicide by cop by going into a store and putting his hands in his pockets and gesturing as if he had a handgun. And that also made me think of racism, white supremacy, how he was able to be apprehended alive. And I didn't hear anything about him going to prison or being incarcerated or put in greater confinement. I did hear that he was recommended to a psychologist. And I suspect that would not happen if it was a non-white person who had experienced atrocities during war and experienced combat war. I doubt they would receive the same treatment. Yeah, that's that for now.
Well said, Mr. Sir. Yeah, I suspect that individual is a white person for sure, to be given such correct treatment as opposed to the mistreatment he surely would have encountered if he was a non-white person. This portion reminds me of last week's discussion where we learned about Paul Shanley, the rapist priest who had multiple victims. And what's interesting about that case is that once word got out that he was on trial for raping multiple children, while as a priest, more people who had totally forgot about that experience started to remember. Their repressed memory started to resurface, and more people came forward. But then racist man and racist woman do what they do best. They withhold information, or they make information no longer constructive. By example, they tried to get his case retrialed and thrown out by saying that repressed memories and that sort of trauma is so-called junk science, when in actuality, racist men and racist women very much are totally in the know on how trauma operates and how trauma functions, because they have been traumatizing other subjects for hundreds of years. So they are well knowledgeable in trauma and its effects on people. So they are just trying to withhold and make information no longer suitable to protect a rapist, which is what racist man, racist woman do. They protect the abusers, the racists from any sort of punishment if they have the power to do so. And more times than not, they definitely have the power to do so. Another great example of the racist man and racist woman tactic of withholding constructive information to help people is during all these so-called great wars, the World War I and World War II. They had this they had post-traumatic stress syndrome. They knew that would be bad for their war business, so they changed and would not allow proper words to be used when talking about a person who was experiencing PTSD. They started to use the terminology not yet diagnosed nervous for people who are experiencing immense trouble um, um, in their psyche. They just started calling them nervous, versus this person has experienced death and mutilation, and therefore they are suffering a great deal of trauma. But they withheld that information from white people, producing a lot of white sacrifices during World War I and World War II. I thought it was very interesting. The quote from the book All Quiet on the Western Front, how the author of that book says a lot of things that I could relate to. Being so traumatized that you lose your feelings, you feel disconnected from everyone, like some sort of alien. And from your observation, everyone is focused on superficial things like how they look, their hair and their clothes, versus trying to solve problems, trying to make the world a place where humans want to be, because currently there has never been a planet Earth where it was experiencing so-called peace or justice. It's always been an incorrect place to be, and that is largely due to white people who practice and maintain the system of white supremacy. And I suspect a lot of victims of racism and white supremacy feel that way, feel very disconnected, feel very alien because of their trauma. It says that culture shapes the expression of trauma and traumatic events from the text, and that can be I suspect that to be a really interesting reality, because maybe that could be used to understand the behaviors from non-white people who are so traumatized that their brain computer has been put in a cycle of doing pretty non-constructive things, like celebrating, going to parties, spending large amounts of time and energy and money on changing their appearance. And I suspect those could be either conscious or subconscious attempts of trying to manage the trauma that they have experienced. Because if one understands racism, white supremacy, then one should understand that all non-white people who live in a so-called neighborhood or a so-called community don't actually live in a neighborhood or a community, but something akin to a concentration camp where mistreatment, suffering, chaos is greatly concentrated in those areas, specifically on those people. So I suspect a lot of non-white people are experiencing various levels of trauma, whether it's sexual trauma or being exposed to mutilation and death, like one would be exposed to in war. But again, I'm remembering that racism, white supremacy is a war against non-white people. Case in point, our behaviors seem to be of that of a group of people who are greatly traumatized. And also, what trauma does to the thinking, it makes rational thinking, constructive thinking near impossible, which is possibly why non-white people are consistently in vicious cycles of doing things that evidence shows will not produce constructive results, i.e., like committing crimes, associating with destructive people who can convince you to get in a car and drive around and shoot other people who look like you. These are effects of no rational thinking at all, failure to understand where the source of one's problems, the source of one's mistreatment could also be an example of incorrect rational thinking, because rational thinking again is disrupted by trauma. It really makes it hard for the brain to focus, because the person begins to react from whatever trauma they may have experienced. They may not remember the trauma totally, or they may not understand its effects totally. Therefore, in a sense, they are always reacting to that trauma, kind of in the same way that those who are victims of racism and white supremacy, they 24/7 are reacting to the system, whether they like to admit it or not. That is the reality. Another thing, white people don't care about anything besides maintaining the system of white supremacy, which is why they did such a great job at preventing any sort of information from being made public that would indicate that war is really non-constructive and should not be taking place. But instead of reflecting on war and maybe trying to solve problems without war, they just refined their business of war. And one of the ways they did that was making claims of PTSD and such related illnesses, non-illnesses anymore. There's a quote mentioned that says, war does not make men sick, but sick men cannot fight war, which is a really insane way of thinking, if you ask me. But this is sort of thinking necessary for racism and white supremacy to continue. Of course, war makes people very sick, because being exposed to people dying, people exploding, people being mistreated is not what the average person is on this planet to do, nor is their body and a mind and brain evolved to experience such endeavors. But racism is a war against non-white people, and many white people will have to participate, will become white sacrifices. So it needs to be understood that due to this war, the majority of people on the planet, white and non-white, are sick in the head for sure. And it definitely shows by us still living in a system of racism and white supremacy. The war, the Great War, which is called racism and white supremacy, has made millions of non-white people absolutely sick, whether they are famished because their area of the world is being greatly attacked by white supremacy, or sick in the mind where victims of racism are more concerned about dancing and having fun than replacing white supremacy with a system of justice. Both are indications of a very, very sick world we live in, made that way by racism and white supremacy. And I'll end it there to see if others have things to share.
Hi everyone. Sorry, I was in a meeting. Something that I think O5 might have talked about it already, but something that thought was really interesting when he was reading off about the quotes from All Quiet on the Western Front, and he was talking about, I guess the author was talking about feeling super detached from society and wondering like how he was like people talk too much or something, which I thought was so interesting because I feel like I've felt that way a lot, or like it's really hard to connect with other people. And it's almost like you have to learn how to be good at like pretending like you're not under attack or like not in a war when you're around other people, because they don't want to hear anything that has to do with the truth, or anything that has to do with the fact that like, hey, maybe the way that we are living is really incorrect. That was the one thing that I got from it, like because I think that lately I've been having a hard time even just having like regular day-to-day conversation with people, because I feel like everyone's conversations is just a distraction, because no one wants to really deal with like the big elephant in the room, which is that like we're pretty much under attack, and the way that we live is really incorrect. I'm trying to figure out my thoughts, but that's what I was just thinking about right now.
Really well said. That can be quite common for attempted counter racists who are a bit less confused about racism being a war against us, and then having to go and interact with victims who could care less or about the war, or who don't believe that we're being attacked, being mistreated on the levels that mean war. It can be very common to feel very isolated, and like you are the that you are the more confused person, because perhaps these people got something figured out that you don't have. But that is not the case. Ignorance is definitely bliss, and a lot of non-white people, if not the majority of them, have been trained so successfully against the system of racism and white supremacy. I mean, have been trained so successfully to remain a victim, unwanting to end it or produce justice or just counter it in any way that they possibly can.
Oh, and another part that I was thinking about that I just thought about was the part where I think it was like soldiers from World War II or World War I, and they were getting shell shock, or they were getting diagnosed with shell shock, and then after a while, the like government was like, you can't keep diagnosing these people with shell shock. You have to basically imply that like you can only, like, the war can only mess up your brain if you're already crazy or something. Like if you're not a good soldier, then the war is going to mess up your brain. Therefore, like, you shouldn't, like, we don't have to pay for you or help you because you shouldn't have been a bad soldier. And reminding me so much of how people pathologize Black people. Like the idea that like Black people are lazy or Black people are on welfare, etc. Instead of understanding like the circumstances of the system that they're living in and how it would affect them and cause PTSD, etc. It's just like, no, they're malfunctioned and there's something wrong with them. So I thought that part was really interesting. And it also reminds me of people who like to be like, oh, I don't let like white supremacy get to me. I don't let it affect me. It's almost like they're trying to say that like if it does affect you, then there's just something wrong with you, and not an understanding that there's something wrong with the way that we live that is, causing like this much distress in us. If that makes sense. Thanks.
Yeah, I wanted to share the part that 0526 and Kamaria had mentioned. It reminded me of how I internalized trauma or experienced trauma at a young age, and like the whole rejecting or like not really participating and in activities with people who are doing quote unquote like people who are like quite vain and investigating superficial things. So for example, when I was in middle school, during like free time activities such as lunch and middle school, like I just hung out completely by myself, isolated in a corner somewhere, playing my video games, my little handheld video games. I didn't really communicate with a group of friends or like collect friends in middle school. And at that same time, I also was not wearing branded clothing, and I was kind of wearing how I felt on my clothes. So I had like a sweater with a bunch of designs on it and a bunch of writing on it. And one of the writings really showcases like how I felt about society and felt about how I was treated on a regular basis. So on the side of my sweater, I had wrote "fuck God" as like a way of saying whatever God that we're supposed to be worshiping does not care about Black people, Black children, because lived in the hood, experienced a lot of trauma, probably already had PTSD by that time. But yeah, I just wanted to share that bit.
Thank you, Serge. Very well said. You too, Miss Ash. Well, Miss Ash, what you said reminds me of how that reality of placing the problem on the person versus white people and the system of white supremacy is very, very common, especially in the area too of education. Black children are often diagnosed with like learning disorders or oppositional disorders, as if they're against the people who are trying to teach or maybe even help them, when these children are victims of racism, white supremacy, and they're also in a war that is being waged against them 24/7. So how are children supposed to behave if they're being mistreated 24/7, all areas of people activity? They can't be correct, focused, thinking people if they are being mistreated to the degree that racism, white supremacy mistreats us. So it makes a lot of sense how their rhetoric, their language, their use of words has been refined so much. But if you're a little bit less confused about racism, white supremacy, you're able to decode it and understand that this is just a practice of white supremacy. So that's very, very interesting point. Thank you for bringing that up. It also there's also a difference between reacting from trauma blindly opposed to facing it constructively in an effort to alleviate the effects of trauma. And that is what non-white people need to do. We need to stop reacting blindly to the traumas, to the war that is being waged against us. We need to understand that this is a war happening against us, operated by a racist man, racist woman, and racist child. And if we have that understanding, we will be able to change our thinking, speech, and behavior in order to not be so affected by the war, because we will be attempting to counter it in whatever way we can. But without the awareness, we will continue to face it blindly. And that is a really good takeaway from this book, that no one in this book was able to heal from their trauma or counter their trauma effectively without being able to face it, without being able to truly look at it and think about it, and even talk about it. Importantly as well, talking about the war is important. Talking about the trauma.
Yeah,
Very, very important. Go ahead,
war
sir.
stuff. So I wanted to talk about the evolution of war trauma. So there's a bit where he's talking about how in World War One, like the soldiers didn't talk about it or communicate it, what happened, because I guess it was what they did and what they witnessed was just so horrifying. And then during World War II, a similar thing happened, where they would, instead of talking, they would have like, the shakes, or they would, their bodies would be so tense and so full of trauma that they would, collapse and be paralyzed. Not paralyzed in the sense that their bones are broken, but in a sense of like paralyzing trauma, and but that can manifest in fear or anxiety or high levels of stress and tension. And then the Vietnam veterans were the folks who were coming back and talking about what happened. They still had some of the similar PTSD symptoms, such as the shakes and I guess mumbling things and like whispering things over and over again, and how they were completely like let down by the U.S. government that they were working for and employed by. Which is to be expected. We understand that racism, white supremacy, and the system of white supremacy does not put a lot of value on its soldiers. It puts a lot of values on the weapons and the equipment, but the human flesh bags are pretty much human flesh bags. And that's that. And that's proven in how they were treated. They came back from war and they're mistreated.
Yeah, and we have a bunch of white people coming back from World War I and World War II. And what was also very common was that for one of the wars, they did not get their payment. Like they were supposed to get some sort of payment for being for each day that they were in the war, but that never came to them, which is another example of how racist man and racist woman do not care about the people who are fighting their wars, unless you do a really good job in the war by killing a ton of people. Then you may be awarded with medals, maybe some celebration. But in terms of getting constructive help, maybe even getting psychological help, that will not happen, because the system of racial white supremacy does not function on helping people. It functions on mistreating people. And the business of white supremacy, one huge component of that is war making, war profits, war profiteering, all of these things. If we truly lived in a place where people were concerned about justice and peace and balance, would not exist. But 2021, we have war, conflicts 24/7. We have the area of the world known as Israel currently dominating area of the world known as Palestine. And this is a symptom of racism, white supremacy. It should be understood as racism, white supremacy, not some sort of holy war or religious war or a so-called ethnic cleansing. This is racism, white supremacy, and the whole Israel and Palestine situation is what racism, white supremacy looks like. Very, very important. Also the importance of repressed memories just could be a example of how our body and mind will attempt to hide things from the person that that the mind doesn't feel like the person is able to handle, which creates repressed memories. And I don't remember a large majority of my early childhood could be due to certain traumatic events that I've only heard about happening in passing from various family members, attempted family members. But I'm sure a large majority of non-white people have tons and tons of repressed memories because looking at the trauma, looking at the mistreatment created by white supremacy can't just be too much. I'm reminded of what Richard King says, in order to really be a correct thinking person, to be so-called healthy, we must be able to look at not only our trauma, but the trauma that our ancestors have gone through. We have to be able to look at the rapes, the castration, the mutilation, the burning of our ancestors, the disfigurement of our ancestors. We have to be able to look at that and understand what has been done to truly heal from it and to truly get it out of our genetics, or else we will continue to pass on traumatized experiences, whether they're encoded in our DNA or whether we haven't learned enough about the war of white supremacy and all the trauma it has caused, so that when we create an offspring, we won't have the ability to see that they are not so damaged by the system like we were, because we will be able to teach them about the system of white supremacy much sooner, so they're not out here being mistreated and are totally confused about why they're being mistreated. So they'll be able to have some answers and not have to rely on a so-called God or a so-called Jesus for answers. I think that's very, very, very important as well.
I have a question. So if we all individually are dealing and trying to heal from our traumas, but we live in a system that constantly, that we're living with the damages of the things we have to deal with every day of racism, how can we all heal as non-whites if white people haven't healed their trauma that they're projecting on to all non-whites? So can we really fully heal if they're not even healed?
Great question, Miss Crease. And I would say no, we cannot be fully healed from the mistreatment of white supremacy until white supremacy has been replaced with a system of justice. That is the only way we'll be able to say we have been fully healed, because that would mean that mistreatment has ceased. But what we can do is diminish the effects of being mistreated by understanding where it's coming from and doing what we can to counter the mistreatment. White people have a lot of things to heal from, whether it's their animosity towards their skin color, or the animosity towards non-white people. They have a lot to heal from, so it's best to focus on the non-white collective, because evidence shows that white people are not interested in changing changing the behaviors that allow white supremacy to be practiced. So it's up to the individual non-white person to understand that they're in a war, and I don't know a war where the participants were at were at a sound mind, or were completely free of symptoms of a war. So
Yeah, I want to respond as well. I would also have to say I do not think that non-white people can heal while the system of racism, white supremacy is flourishing and, you know, business per usual. I say this because historically, whenever there's been glimpses of non-white people, especially Black people, making an effort to be constructive, it is often that white people go into those places and kill the non-white Black people. They like kill the Black people. For example, in Tulsa, Oklahoma, the city was bombed by the police force, and literally bombed with bombs from airplanes, and a lot, like thousands of Black people were killed, probably even more, probably more than they're allowing to put on record. And that was because this city was economically in a position to become a threat to the global system of racism, white supremacy. And many people are unaware that, you know, it wasn't just this one Black city that was bombed. There are several Black flourishing cities that were becoming a threat to the status quo. And whenever someone uses the term status quo, just understand that they're talking about the system of racism, white supremacy. They're just using improper language. But yeah, so in 2021, if Black people were starting a movement to heal, it would be stopped immediately by those who you know, sustain and practice racism, white supremacy 24/7, 365 days a year.
I think that's an amazing question. And I'm only going to be reiterating from the answers given, because it's been answered definitely. But most definitely it's going to be impossible for, you know, it'll be very hard for Black people to heal if white people do not heal from their own trauma, because of everything that we do is aggressive to them, that is towards our progress and our growth. Even like Ashley had said in the chat earlier, even self-healing is aggressive to white people. So so we will be constantly under attack, even if we separate and try and form segregation. So it's not up to us to heal white people, but it's up to us to make it clear that they are damaged, no matter how well presented, how civilized, how orthodox they can be in a work environment, until they deal with those little cues and those emotional attitudes deeply subbedded in their DNA, which they've ignored, and what they do to keep the ignorance alive and keep their civilization seeming normal is this put into the forefront Black people who say racism doesn't exist, put into the forefront the Black people who basically say, oh, just get on with it, and highlighting those in society as, look, it's possible. So we as Black people think, okay, this is a way around it, or it's just playing the game, but internally we're damaging ourselves to be self-hating. And then we are the problem for our own society. So it's until their own attitudes are fixed, everything we do will be aggressive and under attack. You just need to be more defensive, I guess.
Yes, that is true. But like we're self-coping with things instead of just trying to, I guess when people feel like they go to therapy, they're fixing themselves. But that's a big part of fixing ourselves, is for other people to fix, because now we're living an imbalanced life where we could probably project ourselves in self-respect or carry ourselves in ways and manners, but it's always going to be tarnished because of the fear that the white supremacy has, that they carry on until we just don't exist anymore.
I think too, like a lot of therapy and healing stuff can also be like detrimental if you're not, like, if you don't have the correct purpose. Because I noticed a lot of people nowadays, like, they use a lot of the therapy language and a lot of like healing language, but it doesn't actually go anywhere. It doesn't actually mean anything. And even like jobs and corporations do that stuff where they'll have like, oh, like a meditation hour or something at a job, and it's like you're forcing me to meditate at this specific hour in this day because for you it looks good for your company, and it also is supposed to just make me a better worker. Like, don't act like you're doing this because you actually care about my mental health. And I think sometimes too, like, I noticed that there's a lot of people who have been in therapy for a long time and they're just worse because sometimes therapy just helps them learn how to like almost like be worse or something. Like, it's like they're like they go into therapy and analyze themselves, but then they don't implement any changes. So they're just aware of all the things that they're doing, but they're not actually implementing changes so that they stop that behavior. And like, I know that there's certain people who go to therapy to get better at manipulating people. And I think that like, that's like what white supremacy has been doing, like, because a lot of people now are talking about how to heal from trauma and things like that. And I think that whenever like white people or the white supremacists are listening to these conversations, it's just helping them get better at manipulating people. What I don't know if I'm making sense.
No, you're making sense.
Yeah, I agree. Miss Kamaria, what I'm getting from what you're saying is that now white people can sometimes run into become worse when attempting to get therapy, because it's so rare for a therapist to tell the non-white person, oh, you're a non-white person, and because you're a non-white person, you are being mistreated by the system of white supremacy. Here's what you can do to alleviate that mistreatment. I'm a person who has done a great number of therapy. Not one what I consider constructive, or one that was produced truth, allowed me to understand racism and white supremacy and that I was a victim of racism and white supremacy. But I do like this quote from chapter 13 on page 220 on the audio, on the PDF. It says, I don't go to therapy to find out if I'm a freak. I go in and I find the one and only answer each week. And when I talk about therapy, I know what people think, that it only makes you selfish and in love with your shrink. But oh, how I loved everybody else when I finally got to talk so much about myself. The last passage is very interesting because non-white people have been trained very well to spend a lot of time and energy thinking about and talking about other people, usually in a non-constructive gossip type of way. But what I've realized is that when I started to understand trauma, not white supremacy, but trauma, and me talking about my trauma and my experiences, not particularly with a therapist, but just talking about it, period, that is what allowed me to experience less effects of my trauma. Just talking about myself and my experiences. I think now why people don't do that enough. We don't really think introspectively about our lives and what we've experienced, and let alone think that way about our lives in order to understand what we're feeling, or to understand why we're doing what we're doing. Because when I began to understand my trauma, it allowed me to pinpoint my emotional regulation was a direct result to certain traumas I've experienced. And that was allowed just simply by me talking about it and being able to connect the dots to myself with myself. So yeah, talking about the problem, talking about yourself and how the problem has affected you, the race problem, that can do do wonders in becoming more correctly and becoming more correct thinking, and that would do wonders to help a person change their behaviors. Because if you understand you live in a system of white supremacy, then we should not be consuming anything that helps to refine and maintain that system. For example, I'm not out here listening to 21 Savage anymore, who raps about killing Black people, because that would do very little to help me think constructively about ways to solve the problem and ways to counter the problem in my day-to-day life. So one needs the awareness, and a lot of times that awareness can come by simply talking about it, given opportunities to talk about it. But in a system that is very, very, very rare and will not happen unless the victim has the will to I hate to say it, but has the will to break out of the matrix of white supremacy. You do that by admitting that you're in a system and reflecting on how that system has retarded you, mistreated you, and made you what you should not be, which is a victim in a war. Any more comments?
Yeah, I was gonna say, I think too, it's important, like, to really think about your intentions for why you're trying to like heal or understand your trauma. Because if you're doing it just so you can like be a more, like, I guess, so-called like functional human, like you can go to work and function in a way that provides you comfort, then I don't know if you're really going to be able to really delve into your psychology and your trauma, because you're not really doing it like, I don't want to say your intentions are incorrect, but your intentions are just to be able to, like, I guess, be able to function in society. And I think that for me, like, something that has been helpful is, like, I guess, seeing my actions more about, like, okay, so how is this going to help me to like produce justice or be prepared to produce justice? And so that's what's been, like, I feel like for me, like, I was in therapy for a while, and reading like the code and ICE papers and things like that has helped me more in how I communicate with other people, because my intentions are now, like, if I want to produce justice or exist in a type of world where a lot of these negative interactions are not happening, then I need to be able to take the steps to be better at communicating my thoughts and feelings and things like that, which in the past I did not take as seriously.
Well said. Same here. I did not get serious until I got my hands on the idea that there's a war being waged against people who look like me, and me being a Black male, I am the ultimate target of this war. So I really need to be about my wits if I am wanting to survive and attempt to counter racism, which every non-white person, especially Black person, should be totally dedicated to until we have a system of justice. Because what else are we on this planet for, if not to produce justice? If not to produce justice, then it's to be a slave. So, and then the follow-up question is, who wants to be a slave in 2021?
I think that's the point of people that they don't know their purpose, because your purpose in life is always going to be bigger than you as yourself. Your purpose is supposed to outlive you while you're gone. So sometimes people don't think in a bigger scale, that it's bigger than them. They kind of think of a smaller scale, that, well, what can help me kind of thing, as opposed to what can help me help others.
Really, I like that. Really well said. Purpose in life is always bigger than oneself. Makes so much sense. Understanding the problem of racism and white supremacy being a global ordeal, and to expect one person to be able to solve it is very daunting thought to have. But again, much better to be a individual person working to replace white supremacy than an individual person that is okay with their mistreatment and the mistreatment of everyone on the planet who looks like them, solely based on the color of their skin. Really, really incorrect way to go about living. So I like to make a comparison to the woman who experienced the immense trauma during her getting her tubes tied during surgery. She was put under anesthetic, and then she woke up during it, still paralyzed, but able to feel the surgery. And I kind of like to think that that's what's happening in 2021. We have very few people, very few non-white people who are awake and seeing the mutilation, the mistreatment, the destruction taking part on planet Earth against them. But there's very few of us who are seeing what's happening. The rest of us are asleep. But just because they're asleep doesn't mean that, you know, white supremacy is not gnashing at their flesh, clawing at their flesh, destroying their flesh, despite them knowing or not knowing. So white supremacy has done an amazing job at putting most non-white people in some sort of some sort of deep sleep, where the mistreatment is totally surrounding us 24/7, but we either don't know what's happening, don't know what to call it, or don't know what to do about it, which is a really, really tragic and pitiful position to be in. But that is what it is.
That reminded me when I was awake when they were gonna start my C-section and they were cutting me and I can feel it. And so they just put me to sleep. I think that's just like a generalization that when people are awake and they see what's going on, they're not doing anything about it or they don't know what to do. They just rather be put to sleep. They rather just live in the bliss of the situation under the system, as long as it's not physically knocking at their door.
Really well said, Miss Johnson. Appreciate that. I think we may be able to get into closing comments unless other folks have things to share from the text.
Closing comment.
Would you like to start, Mr. Cert?
I don't mind. Yeah. My closing comment, since people were talking about hospital experiences and medical experiences, I wasn't really allowed to be asleep to racism, white supremacy, because I was forced to understand that I was under attack because of the abuse that I experienced via the hands of white people. For example, when I was a young child, I had a really grueling dental surgery without any anesthesia, any type of numbing. And I suspect that the doctors were doing this as a way to inflict as much pain onto me as possible. And I remember the experience like a horror movie, like being restrained, screaming, and having like these white doctors hold me down and like stick out these drills in my mouth. And I remember the blood gushing out my gun. I remember I can remember so many micro moments of this. So that showed me that, okay, these people, these Urugus are very different. They must be doing this because I'm not white. So I was, ever since that happened, I expect to be mistreated. I expect to be harmed. I'm not gonna like pretend like my reality is not my reality, because that's me entering the matrix. That's me going back to the world where I will just be stuck and I won't know why. At least now, if I get stuck, I know why. Because there's this force. It's not invisible anymore. It's racism, white supremacy. It's not an invisible force anymore. It's a wall, and then it's white and it's really, really big. And I heard it goes all the way to space now.
Really well said, Mr. Cert. And I do believe it has reached space. It has reached other planets and has no intention of slowing down its expansion, which is why producing justice, guaranteeing no one is allowed to be mistreated, and those who need constructive help receive constructive help, is what this planet desperately needs. And any individual, white or non-white, who thinks otherwise, perhaps it's not suitable for this planet. Anyone like to share a closing comment?
Yeah, I'll go. I think today's discussion was fantastic. I really enjoyed listening to everybody's comments on the book, what we heard in this chapter of the book. I think it's important to pay attention to our traumas and like what Ashley said. Actually, that's something I took away very well in terms of what the intentions behind healing. If you're healing to be able to function, then you will stop at a certain point and then other things will unearth. And it's very important to do the full necessary shadow work that's needed to not even just function, to know more of your purpose, to be able to be more in tune with your purpose, because a lot of the times it's usually buried in there in terms of maybe who you can help once you've healed from it. who you can further get out of these rabbit holes so we can be more of a collective unit, because that's what I believe we all should be moving towards in order to further push away white supremacy and its infiltration into our mindsets in relation to even thinking that's any kind of way to succeed. But yeah, thank you so much for this discussion today. It was very nurturing for my brain.
Thank you.
My closing comment is this discussion was great. It learning the different aspects of different traumas and postpartum and how things you can forget. And then it seems like the happier moments in life, you kind of forget certain details. But the most traumatic moments in your life, you'll always know the specific details, and the way it triggers you is a thing that we're all gonna live with, to the point where we're just trying to fix ourselves for the bigger picture. But just to understand what's going on is a closer step to where we need to be to solve the issues that we have now.
Really well said. Closing comments, Miss Kamaria.
Yeah, oh, can you hear me?
Yes, ma'am.
Oh, okay, sorry. My closing comments are that I agree with what everyone was saying, and I really appreciate everything that everyone shared. I learned a lot. I think that this book is really an important book to read, and I think that it's been really nice to read it under this context, like with an understanding of white supremacy, because we're able to decode it in different ways. I think that's all I have to say.
Really well said. And agreed. This book about trauma, racism, white supremacy, it uses the word racism 0 times throughout this entire book, which goes to show that white people are not going to be the ones to contextualize trauma with white supremacy. We are going to be the ones who have to do that. That's why I think the universe and the creator for the works of the ISIS papers, post-traumatic slave syndrome, all these works who do so much to help us victims become less confused, and also giving us a tool set and how to counter the problem, and most importantly gives us a purpose, and that purpose is to produce justice on planet Earth. So help us, creator. But for my closing comment, when I first discovered trauma, and that trauma is such a thing, was when I decided to dedicate my life to mending and healing trauma. But I was still confused in my understanding and my making that decision, because I did not have the context of white supremacy behind it. But now I know my purpose, and my life dedication is to producing justice, guaranteeing no one is allowed to be mistreated, and guaranteeing that those who need help receive constructive help. And I have been able to become a correct thinking person because of the works of Neely Fuller Jr., Dr. Francis Cress Wilson, Dr. Marimba. So very, like what Ms. Ash just said, this book is very important to study, but most importantly, it's very important to study within the context of white supremacy, because this is a total dominating force that surrounds everything that we do and attempt to do. So it's really important to have an understanding of white supremacy what it is and how it works. And this book definitely provides great insight into that, and also into what Mrs. Sir has mentioned, how the Yurugus operate, how the Europeans, white people operate, because those are the ones that we should be worried about. The white people who continue and allow racism, white supremacy to be practiced. But that will be all for this week's. I appreciate everyone's comments, questions, and insight. I'll see everyone next week.